They carried 70 pounds of fuel on their backs and a death sentence with every step. One bullet could turn them into a fireball. Their life expectancy in combat, sometimes just 5 minutes. Yet these men walked forward anyway. Into bunkers, into caves, into the jaws of certain death. This is the untold story of the most dangerous job of World War II, the flamethrower operator. Picture this, a U.S. Marine scrambling across the black sands of Iwo Jima in February 1945. On his back, 2 metal tanks sloshing with fuel, weighing nearly 70 pounds. In his hands, a wand-like weapon with a nozzle that could unleash hell itself. The men around him carry rifles and grenades, but he carries something different, something far more terrifying, both to the enemy and to himself. He is a flamethrower operator, and in that moment, his life expectancy is brutally short. Some reports claimed that once engaged in combat, a flamethrower man could expect to live only minutes, sometimes as little as 5. Because if one bullet hit those vulnerable tanks on his back, the result was instant death in a fireball. Yet these men went forward anyway. They had to. The weapon they carried was often the only way to root out Japanese bunkers dug deep into volcanic rock, or German pillboxes reinforced with steel and concrete. When rifles and artillery failed, fire was the only answer. And so, burdened by the weight of their tanks, glowing like beacons the moment they fired, flamethrower operators advanced into withering machine gun fire, knowing every enemy soldier would be aiming for them first. Imagine the terror of that role. You are the one man on the battlefield everyone wants dead. Your comrades cover you desperately, firing at anything that moves, because they know if you fall, their advance may falter. You know, too, that you are carrying not just a weapon, but a target. Every step is a gamble. Every second could be your last. This was not just another job in the arsenal of war. It was perhaps the single most dangerous duty of World War II. And yet thousands of young men took it on, charging forward with liquid fire strapped to their backs, reshaping battles at a terrible cost. Their story begins here, with the sheer, visceral danger of carrying a flamethrower into combat. Fire has always been a weapon. Long before tanks, before rifles, before even gunpowder, armies understood the terrifying power of flame. In the ancient world, soldiers wielded primitive flamethrower-like devices, spraying burning oil or sulfur through tubes to engulf enemy fortifications. The Byzantine Empire had its infamous Greek fire, a substance so feared it was said to burn even on water. Medieval records describe defenders pouring boiling pitch and lighting it aflame as attackers stormed city walls. Fire was chaos, fire was fear, and fire was final. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that fire became mechanized, engineered into something portable, controlled, and absolutely devastating. In 1915, during the nightmare stalemate of World War I, German troops unveiled the first modern flamethrowers, or Flammenwerfer. They carried them across no man's land and unleashed jets of fire into British and French trenches. The effect was instant and horrifying. Soldiers weren't just killed, they were consumed. Whole dugouts erupted into infernos and survivors fled in terror. The weapon's physical destruction was terrifying, but its psychological impact was even greater. Soldiers whispered about it in fear. It was a new level of horror in a war already defined by misery. By the end of the conflict, flamethrowers had been used in hundreds of attacks. Other nations had seen the results, and none of them forgot. So when World War II began in 1939, every major power either had flamethrowers in its arsenal or was racing to build them. The legacy of fire as a weapon of war was reborn, now heavier, deadlier, and ready to be unleashed on a global scale. To understand why flamethrower operators had the most dangerous job of the war, you need to know how these weapons worked. Picture a soldier carrying a backpack made of two large cylindrical tanks. Inside, pressurized fuel, often gasoline, later thickened into napalm to stick and burn hotter. Connected to the tanks, a hose and a handheld nozzle. At the end of that nozzle, a trigger and a small igniter, essentially a flame or spark ready to set the fuel alight. When the operator pulled the trigger, a stream of fuel erupted forward, instantly ignited into a torrent of fire. The blast could reach 20 to 40 yards, depending on the model. It was enough to engulf trenches, pillboxes, bunkers, or caves in seconds. But here's the catch. The tanks only held enough fuel for about 10 seconds of continuous fire. That's it. 10 seconds of life or death, depending on how you used it. And for the man carrying it, the risks were immense. Fully loaded, the pack weighed nearly 70 pounds, slowing you down, exhausting you before you even reached the fight. The second you fired, your position was revealed by the blaze and smoke, making you the prime target of every rifle and machine gun. And perhaps worst of all, those fuel tanks were not armored. One lucky enemy shot could ignite them, turning the operator into a living torch. Every flamethrower man went forward knowing this. He was carrying a bomb on his back. And yet, when bunkers needed clearing or caves had to be flushed out, there was no substitute. Only fire could finish the job. As the world plunged into war again in 1939, flamethrowers quickly returned to the battlefield. Germany used them during its invasion of Poland, terrifying defenders who had no answer to jets of fire ripping through bunkers. On the Eastern Front, Soviet fortifications fell to the same weapon. The United States, however, lagged behind. At first, U.S. forces had no effective man-portable flamethrower. But by 1942, the Army introduced its first model, the M1. It was based on old designs from World War I, heavy, clunky, and prone to failure. The ignition was unreliable, the fuel leaked, and many soldiers distrusted it. But necessity forced them to use it. By 1943, improvements were made with the M1A1. But the real breakthrough came in 1944. That year, American scientists perfected napalm, a thickened fuel that clung to whatever it touched, burning hotter and longer. Combined with the new M2 flamethrower, napalm turned the weapon into something far more effective and far more feared. The M2 was still brutally heavy, but it had a better ignition system, longer range, and devastating results against fortifications. This evolution came just in time. In the Pacific, Japanese forces were digging into caves and bunkers that no rifle or artillery strike could reliably clear. The flamethrower became the only answer. By 1944, every Marine and Army unit heading into battle carried flamethrower teams, young men shouldering 70 pounds of liquid fire, knowing they were walking into hell. The Pacific War was unlike anything U.S. forces had faced before. On island after island, Japanese defenders refused to fight in the open. Instead, they carved fortresses into the very earth, pillboxes of steel-reinforced concrete, tunnels that twisted for miles, and caves hidden in volcanic rock. Artillery and naval bombardments would thunder for hours, sometimes days. But when the dust cleared, the Japanese soldiers were still there, emerging from their bunkers to pour deadly fire on American troops trying to land. Conventional weapons struggled to dislodge these defenses. Grenades might kill a handful inside a cave, but most survived. Rifle fire bounced uselessly off reinforced walls. Even tank shells often failed to collapse the subterranean structures. The casualty rates for infantry storming these strongholds were staggering. Enter the flamethrower. This weapon, as brutal as it was, became the only reliable way to clear the Japanese out. A single jet of fire shot into a bunker, slit, or cave mouth could kill instantly, or worse, suffocate defenders as oxygen was consumed inside. Survivors often ran screaming into the open, where they were cut down by riflemen. Marines described entire positions going quiet in seconds once flame was introduced. It wasn't just effectiveness, it was necessity. Battles like Tarawa in 1943 proved that without flamethrowers, clearing an island fortress would cost far too many American lives. By 1944, every Marine division had designated flamethrower operators. These men knew their job: to walk right up to the most dangerous spot on the battlefield and burn it out. It was gruesome work. Operators carried the heaviest burden and faced the shortest odds. But as one Marine bluntly put it, there was no other way to get the job done. Nowhere is the story of the flamethrower more unforgettable than on Iwo Jima in February 1945. The island itself was a fortress, miles of interconnected caves and bunkers honeycombed into volcanic rock. Thousands of Japanese defenders vowed to fight to the death, making every foot of ground a killing zone. Marines struggled to advance against pillboxes whose interlocking fields of fire cut down wave after wave. Into this inferno stepped Corporal Herschel Woody Williams. Carrying his 70-pound flamethrower, he volunteered to take on the bunkers himself. For hours, Williams crawled and sprinted across open ground under withering machine gun fire. Bullets clanged off the tanks on his back as he crept forward, knowing a single hit could mean instant death. One by one, Williams approached the pillboxes. Covering fire from fellow Marines distracted defenders just long enough for him to crawl close, ignite the wand, and unleash torrents of flame inside. Entire bunkers erupted, Japanese soldiers killed or forced to flee in panic. Time and again, Williams returned to friendly lines to grab another loaded flamethrower, then pushed forward again. In just 4 hours, he destroyed multiple enemy strongpoints that had pinned down his unit. His courage broke the deadlock, allowing Marines to advance and eventually capture Mount Suribachi. For his actions, Williams received the Medal of Honor, the highest military award in the United States. But Williams himself never saw it as heroism. He later said, "I was just trying to protect my buddies." His story represents the extreme bravery and the extreme danger of flamethrower operators. Without them, the outcome at Iwo Jima might have been far bloodier. After Iwo Jima came Okinawa, the last and bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Japanese defenders had learned from earlier campaigns, digging even deeper networks of caves and tunnels into the island's hills. Direct assaults cost thousands of American lives. So U.S. forces developed a grim but effective strategy they called corkscrew and blowtorch. Here's how it worked. Machine gunners and riflemen would lay down suppressive fire, keeping defenders pinned. Then, flamethrower operators would advance, sometimes crawling, sometimes running, toward the cave or bunker entrance. At point-blank range, they unleashed sheets of fire inside. Seconds later, demolition teams followed, tossing grenades and satchel charges to collapse the position for good. It was brutal, it was exhausting, and it was deadly for everyone involved. Many flamethrower men didn't make it back. Snipers waited for them. Machine guns targeted them immediately. But when it worked, it broke even the most fanatical resistance. Japanese soldiers often chose suicide over being burned alive, so entire positions would fall once fire was introduced. On Okinawa's ridges, hundreds of caves were cleared this way, step by bloody step. U.S. commanders concluded that flamethrowers had become one of the most vital infantry weapons in the Pacific. Without them, The invasion of Okinawa might have dragged on even longer, with even higher losses. The phrase corkscrew and blowtorch became etched in history as the definitive tactic of America's island-hopping war. It captured the grim reality. To win, U.S. troops had to literally burn their enemies out of the earth. While the Pacific became the stage where flamethrowers earned their grim reputation, they were also used in Europe, though with different results. On D-Day in June 1944, some U.S. Army engineers carried flamethrowers ashore at Omaha Beach. The plan was to burn out German pillboxes that had survived naval bombardment. In a few instances, it worked. Witnesses recall seeing bursts of fire erupt from bunker slits as operators pressed forward under impossible fire. But many of those brave men never made it far. Loaded down with 70 pounds of fuel, silhouetted by the chaos of the beach, they became easy targets. The European terrain made things harder. Instead of caves and jungle, there were hedgerows, villages, and open fields. Terrible conditions for flamethrower troops who had to expose themselves just to get within range. At first, the weapon was underused, partly because few soldiers were trained to employ it properly. But as the war pushed into Germany, its value became clearer. Take the battle for Aachen in late 1944, one of the first major cities inside the German border. American infantry found themselves bogged down by fortified houses and cellars, where fanatical German defenders refused to surrender. Commanders brought in flamethrower teams. As flames poured into basements and bunkers, the effect was instant. Whole groups of soldiers, terrified of fire, abandoned positions they had sworn to hold. In one sector, more than 70 German troops surrendered after a single flamethrower blast convinced them resistance was futile. Later, in assaults on the Siegfried Line, the concrete belt guarding Germany's west, flamethrowers again proved decisive. Operators had to drag their tanks through rubble under sniper fire, but their reward was the sudden collapse of strong points that would have otherwise bled Allied infantry dry. In Europe, flamethrowers weren't as dominant as in the Pacific, but they still shifted the tide in brutal urban and fortified battles. Flamethrowers weren't just weapons, they were nightmares in human form. To the enemy, few sights inspired more primal terror than the hiss and roar of liquid fire pouring toward them. Japanese soldiers called flamethrower men demons. German troops often fled at the first sight of flame, surrendering rather than face incineration. Even hardened veterans admitted, of all the horrors of war, fire was the one they could not stomach. For defenders trapped in bunkers, it was worse. A grenade might kill quickly, a bullet was impersonal. But fire suffocated, burned, and terrified. Many Japanese considered it more honorable to take their own lives than be burned alive. American commanders noted this effect, how the psychological shock of flame often broke resistance faster than any bomb or artillery barrage. But the toll was not only on the enemy. Flamethrower operators themselves carried scars, some physical, many emotional. Veterans described the horrifying sound of men screaming inside bunkers, or the smell that lingered after an attack. Some admitted they tried not to think about what they had done. Others confessed it haunted them for life. One Marine put it bluntly, "It was the worst job you could have, but someone had to do it." On the battlefield, flamethrower men knew they had targets on their backs. The moment they opened fire, every enemy weapon zeroed in. That stress alone was crushing. Comrades often gave them extra covering fire, silently praying they would survive. And if captured, flamethrower operators could expect no mercy. Accounts suggest enemies would execute them on the spot, consumed by hatred for the weapon they carried. Even among Allied soldiers, there was debate. Was this weapon too cruel? After the war, those debates grew louder, eventually leading to restrictions on flamethrower use in later decades. But in World War II, moral questions were set aside. For the men in the fight, it was simple. Use the weapon, or watch your friends die trying to storm bunkers by hand. When the smoke cleared in 1945, one fact was undeniable. Flamethrowers had changed the face of modern combat. In the Pacific, they were game changers. Japanese bunkers that might have held out for days were reduced in minutes. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, countless American lives were spared, at the terrible expense of the few men brave enough to carry flamethrowers forward. In Europe, they broke through German strongholds in cities like Aachen, helping end stalemates that might otherwise have cost thousands more casualties. Yet their legacy is complex. Tactically, flamethrowers proved indispensable. No other infantry weapon could clear caves, trenches, and pillboxes so effectively. Strategically, they sped up campaigns that might have dragged on indefinitely. But morally, they left behind a bitter taste. Even veterans who acknowledged their necessity often admitted they hated the weapon. To them, it symbolized the ugliest side of war, the willingness to burn other human beings alive in order to survive. After World War II, armies continued to use flamethrowers in Korea, in Vietnam, but public opinion shifted. By the late 20th century, most nations abandoned the man-portable flamethrower altogether, relying instead on other explosives or armored vehicles to fill the role. Today, they're largely remembered as relics of an age when desperation demanded desperate tools. And yet the image endures. A lone soldier, bent under the weight of his tanks, striding forward into fire and bullets, unleashing streams of liquid flame. It is one of the most haunting and unforgettable symbols of World War II, a job so dangerous, so terrifying, that it still commands respect today. For those men, every mission was a gamble with death. And yet, they did it anyway. Not for glory, not for fame, but because their comrades needed them. That is the legacy of the flamethrower operator, the most dangerous job of World War II.